The black sedan came down Allegheny Road at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, and everyone on the block knew immediately that it did not belong there. Not because it was
I
expensive.
really think this is the
There were
perfect fit
expensive
for your
things in
family,
Pittsburgh.
Daniel. The safety
Not because
rating
it
is
was black.
unmatched.
Half the cars in the city were black. It was the way the car moved slowly, deliberately, with the specific confidence of something that has already decided where it is going and is simply taking its time arriving. The kind of confidence that did not come from the neighborhood. The kind that had never needed to. Roy Tatum stopped sweeping his front step and just stood there, broom in both hands, watching. He had run the corner grocery at the end of Allegheny Row for 23 years. He had seen things come down this street. He knew the difference between something passing through and something that had come with a purpose. This had come with a purpose. A group of kids on bikes slowed without being told to. A woman 2 houses down let her curtain fall back into place, then moved it aside again almost immediately. Even the light seemed to adjust the low October sun, catching the sedan's clean hood and holding it there the way light sometimes finds the one thing in a frame that matters and refuses to let go of it. The car stopped in front of number 17. Daniel Pruitt was standing in his doorway when it happened. He had a dish towel in his hand. He had been drying the last coffee mug from the rack and he had not put it down yet. He just stood there in the doorway and watched the car come to a stop and felt something shift in his chest. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The thing your body does when it recognizes a shape it has been carrying for years, even when your mind has spent considerable effort convincing you that the carrying was over. He was 42 years old. He had the kind of face that had once been easy, the kind that smiled at strangers on job sites without thinking about it, the kind that lit up when he talked about load calculations and structural geometry and the technical things he loved in a way that made younger workers feel like they could ask him anything and receive a real answer. That face was still there technically, but 6 years had drawn something careful over it, a guardedness that did not come from bitterness alone. It came from having learned more than once that trust was a currency he could no longer afford to spend without thinking first. Behind him, a small face appeared at elbow height. Clara, 8 years old. She peered around his arm with the focused, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet decided that watching too closely might cost her something. Her left hand found the back of his shirt and gripped it lightly. Not afraid, just present, the way she always was. The car door opened. The woman who stepped out was around 30, maybe slightly older. Dark coat hair pulled back. She was not flashy. She did not look like someone who needed to prove anything with what she wore. She looked like someone who had thought very carefully about how to appear less threatening than she actually was. She stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the house the way someone looks at a thing they have been building the courage to face for a very long time. Then she started up the cracked front path. She walked the way someone walks when they have rehearsed a moment 100 times in their head and are now discovering that the real thing is different from every version they practiced. There was steadiness in her step. But underneath it, if you knew how to look, and Daniel Pruitt knew how to look, there was something else. Something that cost her something to keep hidden. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at him. "My name is Renata Voss," she said. "My father passed away 8 weeks ago. I came to pay his debt." The street went completely silent. Daniel did not move. He did not speak. He looked at her with the face of a man who had learned a long time ago not to react to things until he understood what they actually were. He knew that name. He had spent 6 years learning how to carry that name without letting it hollow him out from the inside. And here it was standing at the bottom of his porch steps in a dark coat on a Tuesday afternoon in October, asking to be acknowledged. Clara's hand tightened slightly on the back of his shirt. Down the block, Roy Tatum had not moved, still holding his broom, still watching. Nobody on Allegheny Row spoke, and the October afternoon just hung there waiting to see what Daniel Pruitt was going to do. There are 2 kinds of tired. There is the tired that sleep fixes, the kind that comes from a long shift or a hard season or a year that asks too much of you. You rest, you recover, you return. That kind of tired has a bottom you can find if you go deep enough. And then there is the other kind, the kind that lives in the way a man holds his shoulders, in the slight pause before he answers a question, not because he does not know the answer, but because he has learned to verify twice before he trusts anything. The kind that becomes part of who you are over years quietly, the way sediment settles into the floor of a river. That is the tired that does not go away with sleep. That is the tire that becomes the foundation of a person. Daniel Pruitt lived in that second kind. He had grown up in Pittsburgh's East Side, the son of a civil engineer who took him to construction sites on weekends and taught him to read the bones of a structure before he could read cursive. By the time Daniel was in his 20s, he had built a reputation that preceded him across 4 states. Project managers requested him by name. He had a gift for understanding what concrete was telling you, the specific language of stress and load, and the quiet warnings that materials give before they stop warning and start failing. He was meticulous. He was credentialed. He was the kind of man who wrote things down. He lived with Clara in a narrow 2-story house on Allegheny Row in the Bridgeton neighborhood on the outer edge of the city. The kind of neighborhood where the grocery store kept a plexiglass barrier at the register, where the school buses ran late every single morning without apology or explanation, where people fixed what was broken themselves because waiting for someone else to fix it was a luxury this street had never been able to afford. The house was clean. Daniel made sure of that. The floors were swept every morning before Clara went to school. The dishes were washed before either of them went to bed. Clara's drawings were taped along the hallway wall in careful straight rows, crayon houses with yellow windows, stick figures with enormous hands reaching towards something just outside the frame, and one purple horse she had explained to him at considerable length occupied its own distinct artistic category and should not be compared to her other work. Small dignities, the kind a man holds on to when the larger ones have been taken from him. 6 years earlier, Daniel Pruitt had been the senior safety supervisor on the Kellerman Bridge project. It was the largest infrastructure contract the city of Pittsburgh had awarded in more than a decade. Funded and developed by Voss Meridian Group, the construction and development company founded by Frank Voss, a man who had built bridges and office towers and transit corridors across 7 states and had the kind of political relationships that made problems disappear before they became public knowledge. It was the job Daniel had spent his entire career working toward. He arrived at the Eastern Span on a Thursday morning in early October before the crew, the way he always did. Routine walk through low-light coffee still warm in his thermos. He crouched near the base of 3 adjacent support columns and found what he found. Diagonal stress fractures, lower third of the load-bearing sections. Subtle but not subtle enough. Not to someone who had seen that exact pattern once before on a project in Baltimore and had watched what happened when the warning was ignored. He did not panic. He did not immediately calculate what this meant for the project timeline or his relationship with the project director. He was simply a man crouching in the early morning light, reading what the concrete was telling him, and what it was telling him was very clear. He went back to the site trailer and wrote the report that same morning. 4 pages, photographs attached, precise language with no hedging and no softening. He described what he saw, where he saw it, what it indicated, and what action he was recommending. Immediate construction halt on the Eastern Span. Independent structural review before any further work on those columns. He submitted it through the project management system before noon. He also sent a physical copy to the Regional Safety Board by certified mail. Tracking number, signature required upon delivery. And he kept a copy at home in a manila folder in the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Because he had learned early in his career that paperwork had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient. He had seen it happen to other men. He was not going to let it happen to him. Gareth Mercer was the project manager on Kellerman. He called Daniel into the site trailer 2 days later, sat him down across from a metal desk covered in permit applications and cost projections, and told him the columns had been reviewed by the company's internal engineering team and found within acceptable tolerance. No halt would be ordered. The timeline would continue as scheduled. Daniel asked to see the internal review documents. Mercer told him the review was proprietary. Daniel escalated to the regional director. The regional director did not return his calls. Not that week, not the week after, not ever. 14 days after Daniel filed his report, a section of scaffolding on the Eastern Span collapsed during a shift change. 4 workers were injured, 2 of them seriously. The structure itself sustained damage that set the project back 8 months and cost the company millions of dollars in repairs delays and contract penalties. That evening, Daniel drove home and went directly to the spare bedroom. 3rd drawer. He found the folder exactly where he had left it. He opened it. The papers were gone. He stood in that room for a long time holding an empty folder, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical exactly what had happened. Nothing else in the room had been touched. Not the dresser, not the bookshelf, Not the cardboard box of Clara's baby photographs on the closet shelf. Just the folder. Just the 4 pages in the photographs. Just the only thing that proved he had ever said anything at all. The official investigation took 5 months. Daniel told the investigators everything. He described the contents of the report in precise technical detail. He gave them the certified mail tracking number. The tracking number confirmed delivery. The regional safety board said they had no record of receiving anything. Without his copy, without a single physical document in his hands, he was just a man claiming he had warned people. The company had lawyers. The company had a paper trail that told a very different story. And Daniel had nothing but his word and the memory of crouching in the early morning light in front of 3 columns that were quietly announcing their own failure. The official investigation concluded 5 months later. The report named Daniel Pruitt as the primary individual responsible for the oversight failure on the Kellerman Bridge Eastern Span. It said he had failed to identify warning signs that any competent professional in his position should have caught. He was terminated the Monday after the report was released. Within 6 months, his name had circulated through every major contractor network in the region. Nobody would hire him. His certifications were suspended pending review. The review was opened and never closed. It simply remained open like a wound that was never allowed to heal so that it could never stop hurting. Then came the second consequence, the one that was worse than all of it combined. His wife Diane had been managing a serious autoimmune condition for 3 years. The treatment required regular infusions, specialist appointments every 6 weeks, medications that cost more than a car payment every month. All of it covered by the health insurance that came with the Voss Meridian contract. All of it gone on the same day as the job. Daniel sold the car. He took on roofing work through a cousin who owed him a favor. Night shifts at a distribution warehouse 2 towns over. He picked up whatever he could find and did it without complaint because there was no room for complaint. There was only the next thing to be done. He borrowed from his brother until his brother had nothing left to lend. He filed every appeal available to him. He wrote letters. He showed up in person at offices that had already decided not to help him. He did everything a man with no institutional backing could do to push back against a machine that had already decided what the story was going to be. It was not enough. Diane died 14 months after the termination. She was in a hospital room that smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. Daniel was holding her hand. Clara was 3 years old, asleep in a chair in the corner, curled under a donated blanket that had a cartoon giraffe on it. Too young to understand. Old enough to remember the shape of the room, the quality of the light, the way her father sat without moving for a very long time after. After that, Daniel stopped expecting anything from the world except the chance to raise his daughter without adding more damage to what she had already survived. He kept the house on Allegheny Row. He found work where he could find it, mostly construction adjacent, the kind where his background was useful, but his name was not prominent enough to trigger a thorough background check. He kept Clara in school. He made sure she had what she needed. He did not talk about Kellerman Bridge. Not ever. Not to anyone. He carried it the way a man carries something very heavy over a very long distance. Not because he forgot it was there, because putting it down was never an option. Frank Voss died on a Wednesday morning in March. He was 67 years old, a stroke fast as these things sometimes go. He was in his office at 6 in the morning, the way he always was, because men like Frank Voss did not stop working until the moment the work stopped for them. His assistant found him at 6:40 when she arrived with the morning brief. He left behind a company valued at close to $2 billion, a board of directors that had relied on his judgment for 4 decades, a house in the hills with 7 bedrooms, and a garden that his daughter Renata had never once seen him sit in, and a reputation that had been carefully managed for 40 years by people whose job it was to make sure nothing complicated ever attached itself to the Voss name. He also left one other thing, a steel safe behind a false panel in his home office. Renata found it 6 days after the funeral when the estate attorneys came to inventory the property. She watched the attorney's assistant press against the wood paneling and heard the quiet, definitive click of the latch releasing. She felt something go cold in her stomach before she even saw what was inside. The safe held the things a man keeps when he wants to be the only person who controls certain information. Bond certificates, a photograph of Frank shaking hands with a mayor from 20 years back, a stack of old correspondence, and a manila folder, thick, rubber-banded, labeled in Frank Voss's own deliberate handwriting. Kellerman. The estate attorney offered to have everything cataloged professionally. Renata told him she would handle this particular folder herself. She waited until the attorneys left. She sat down on the floor of her father's office, still wearing the dark dress from the post-funeral reception that had ended 3 hours earlier. She undid the rubber band, she opened the folder, and she read. The first document was Daniel Pruitt's original warning report, all 4 pages. Photographs included. Precise, methodical language, a man doing his job correctly and completely, and in writing with evidence. The report that had supposedly never existed. The report that the official investigation had found no trace of. It had been here in this safe since the week of the collapse. The second document was an independent structural assessment commissioned not by Voss Meridian, but by a city engineer named Elspeth Garland. 4 pages. It confirmed every single thing Daniel Pruitt had identified. Diagonal stress fractures in the load-bearing columns of the eastern span. Risk of structural failure under operational load. Recommendation, immediate construction, halt pending full independent review. It was dated 14 days before the scaffolding collapsed. It had never been entered into the official investigation file. The third item was a handwritten memo in Frank Voss's own deliberate hand. 3 sentences addressed to Gareth Mercer, initialed at the bottom. Keep the timeline. Adjust documentation after the fact if necessary. I'll manage the board. Renata sat on that floor for a long time. The house was completely dark around her. She had not moved to turn on a light. She read those 3 sentences again and again, looking for a different way to understand them. A context that would explain them as something other than what they clearly were. There was no other context. But then she found the fourth item, a small envelope tucked beneath the other documents. Inside, a personal check drawn on Frank Voss's private account. $47,000. Signed in the same deliberate hand as the memo. The name on the payable line was a man she did not immediately recognize. It took her 2 weeks and a forensic accountant to understand what she was looking at. The name on the check was the same name that appeared on a small internal processing memo from the Regional Safety Board, a memo that had quietly logged Daniel Pruitt's certified delivery as undeliverable due to insufficient sender information. Frank Voss had not simply buried the report. He had paid someone to make sure it stayed buried. Renata spent the next 2 weeks doing what she needed to do. She hired a private document examiner to verify every item in the folder. She cross-referenced dates against archived city records. She requested internal investigation transcripts through her authority as incoming CEO of Voss Meridian. Every source confirmed the same thing. The memo was real, the check was real, the timing was real. And Daniel Pruitt's warning report, the one that had disappeared from every official record, had been sitting in her father's safe since the week of the collapse. Frank had read it. He had understood exactly what his senior safety supervisor had found. He had made a choice. And then he had paid a government official $47,000 to make sure that choice could never be traced back to him. 3 sentences. A man's career, a man's wife, 4 workers who did not have to be hurt. A small girl who grew up under a borrowed blanket in a hospital chair. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Renata Voss drove to Allegheny Row. She drove herself. No lawyers, because lawyers would have turned it into a negotiation, and this was not a negotiation. No prepared settlement offer, because a number on a piece of paper felt like an insult measured against what had actually been taken. Just her, a manila folder, and a debt that was not hers to pay, but that she was not willing to keep inheriting. She had rehearsed what she would say. Standing at the bottom of those porch steps, looking up at a man holding a dish towel. A man who had the kind of careful stillness that only comes from long and deliberate practice. She found that none of her rehearsed sentences were right. So she said the only true thing she had. Daniel did not invite her in. He stepped off the porch and stood at the top of the steps instead, close enough to hear her clearly, far enough that the distance still said something. Clara stayed in the doorway behind him, watching Renata with the open, unfiltered attention of a child who had not yet learned that staring was impolite, and who would probably decide that rule did not apply to her even when she did. "What debt?" Daniel said quietly. Not a question exactly. The kind of statement a man makes when he already knows the shape of the answer and is deciding whether he wants it confirmed. Down the block, Roy Tatum had still not moved. The October light had shifted while they were standing there, gone lower and more golden, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look more consequential than it might actually be. Somewhere up the block, a screen door opened and closed. A dog started barking 2 streets over and then stopped. Daniel looked at the woman at the bottom of his steps. He had spent 6 years learning how to carry the name Voss without letting it undo him. He had learned to carry it quietly the way you carry something heavy over a very long distance, not because you forget it is there, but because putting it down was never among the available options. And now the name was standing in front of him, and the name had a face. Clara's hand found the back of his shirt again. She gripped it lightly. She did not say anything. She was 8 years old, and she understood in the way children understand the things that matter most, that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is simply to be present while they figure out what they are going to do next. The afternoon waited. Daniel Pruitt looked at Renata Voss for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the clean black sedan parked at the curb, the way it sat against the backdrop of Allegheny Row, the chain-link fences, the telephone wires that sagged a little lower every winter, the hand-painted sign on Roy Tatum's grocery at the end of the block. Then he looked back at her. He did not invite her in, but he did not walk away either. She came back the next afternoon. Same time, same car. She parked in the same spot in front of number 17 as if the space had been designated for her, as if Allegheny Row had accepted the arrangement, even if Daniel Pruitt had not yet made that decision for himself. He was in the kitchen when he heard the car. He did not go to the window. He finished what he was doing, washing the cutting board, drying it, returning it to its place, and then he went to the front door and opened it before she reached the steps. She stopped at the bottom, same as the day before. He sat down on the top step. Not an invitation inside, not a refusal. Something in between, which was the most he was willing to offer, and which she appeared to understand without being told. She sat on the lower step near the path. Clara appeared in the doorway approximately 40 seconds later, backpack still on from school, homework folder already in hand, with the particular efficiency of a child who had assessed the situation and determined that doing her homework on the porch was for reasons she did not feel obligated to explain the correct choice for this specific afternoon. She settled between them. She opened her folder and began working on long division with the focused concentration she brought to everything she decided mattered. She did not look up, but she was listening. Daniel knew she was listening, the way he always knew something in the angle of her head, the quality of her stillness. Renata spoke carefully. She described what she had found in the safe in the order she had found it. Daniel's original report, Elspeth Garland's independent structural assessment, the handwritten memo. She did not rush and she did not soften the language. She understood Daniel's sense that there was no version of this that would not hurt, and that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of insult. When she mentioned the memo, 3 sentences, Frank Voss's handwriting addressed to Gareth Mercer, Daniel's jaw tightened once. A small movement, almost nothing. He kept his eyes on the middle distance and his hands flat on his knees. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because it's true," Renata said, "and because you deserve to know it." "That's not an answer." His voice was level, no anger in it, just precision. "Lots of things are true. People with your resources don't drive to neighborhoods like this one to share true things out of the goodness of their hearts. What do you want from me?" It was the right question. Renata did not flinch from it. She told him she wanted to reopen the record, through proper legal channels. She wanted the official investigation corrected. She wanted his name cleared in the permanent public record. She wanted the documentation that had been suppressed to become part of that record, not a private settlement, not a confidential acknowledgement, but a real and public correction. "And what does Voss Meridian get out of that?" Daniel said. "Nothing. The company loses. The board will fight me. The stock will drop when this becomes public. I know that." "Then why?" Renata held his gaze. "Because my father built everything he had on what he did to you. That means everything I inherited is built on it too. I'm not willing to keep living on top of that silence." Clara looked up from her long division. She studied Renata for exactly 3 seconds with the unself-conscious directness of someone who has not yet learned to disguise an evaluation as something more polite. Then she looked back down at her paper. Daniel watched his daughter. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not toward trust, not yet, but away from the hardest version of no. "Come back tomorrow," he said. Same time. Roy Tatum had an opinion about most things and kept most of those opinions to himself. He had learned over 23 years of running the corner grocery on Allegheny Row that unsolicited opinions were attacks on relationships you could not afford to damage. People came to his store to buy milk and bread and lottery tickets, and sometimes just to stand somewhere warm for a few minutes when the cold outside was the particular kind that got into your joints and stayed. They did not come for his assessments of their personal situations. But this was different. He caught Daniel alone at the register on the second day, while Clara was in the candy aisle reading every label without buying anything, which was what she always did and which Roy had come to find quietly admirable. He bagged Daniel's groceries slowly, deliberately. "I've seen this before," Roy said. He did not look up from the bag. "Different car, different coat, same story. They come in with apologies and leave with signatures. 2 years later, the whole block gets rezoned and everyone's gone." "She hasn't asked me to sign anything," Daniel said. "Yet," Roy said. He slid the bag across the counter. "They never ask for the thing they actually want until they've made you feel like they're doing you a favor." Daniel did not argue. He had been thinking the same thing. He carried that thought back up the street and sat with it that evening after Clara was asleep. He turned it over the way he turned over everything these days, looking at it from different angles, testing it for the places where it was solid and the places where it was not. Roy was not wrong about the pattern. It was a real pattern. It had happened in neighborhoods exactly like this one to people who had considerably less to begin with than they did when it was over. But there was something about Renata that resisted that pattern. It was not her sincerity. Sincerity was easy to perform. Daniel had watched people perform it his entire adult life and had become precise about recognizing the performance. This did not feel like one. What was harder to explain was the specificity of what she knew. She knew the exact date of his original report, not approximate exact. She knew Elspeth Garland's name, which had never appeared in any public document related to the Kellerman case. She knew the internal filing number that only someone with access to actual investigation records could have possessed. These things could not have come from news coverage or public records. They could only have come from documents sealed inside a folder that no one outside Frank Voss's private office had ever seen. That did not prove her intentions were clean, but it proved the folder was real, and the folder was the only thing that actually mattered. The third visit, she brought the recording. She arrived with a small portable speaker and a USB drive in addition to the manila folder. She sat on the lower step. Daniel sat at the top. Clara settled between them, homework folder open, purple pen in hand, with the composure of someone who had decided that whatever was happening on this porch was something she was entitled to witness. Renata set the speaker on the step between them. She looked at Daniel. He nodded once. She connected the drive. She pressed play. Frank Voss's voice filled the quiet porch. Low, measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room and had stopped noticing it. He was talking to Gareth Mercer. The call was dated 4 days before the scaffolding collapse. Frank told Mercer to keep the crew on schedule. He said the column assessment had been handled internally and the findings were acceptable. When Mercer mentioned that the safety supervisor had escalated his concerns to the regional safety board, Frank said, "That's been managed. If anything happens on site, we document it as equipment failure. The supervisor's report doesn't exist officially, so it can't be cited. Make sure Briggs knows the timeline on the filing." The recording ended. The street was completely silent. Not the ordinary quiet of a residential block in late afternoon. Something else, the specific silence that falls when something true and irreversible has been said out loud, and the air needs a moment to absorb it. Daniel did not move. He looked at the speaker sitting on the step between them. He looked at his own hands on his knees. He looked at the street, at the pale gathering of light under the lamp at the end of the path. "Play it again," he said. Renata played it again. Daniel listened with his eyes closed this time. Not to the words, but to the voice itself. The cadence, the specific, unhurried weight of it, the faint rasp at the edges of certain consonants. When it ended the second time, he opened his eyes. "Elspeth Garland," he said. Renata waited. "I know that name," he said. "Not from the case, from before it." He was quiet for a moment, organizing what he was remembering. "She came to the Kellerman site about a month before the collapse. Said she was conducting a routine city infrastructure survey. She asked me specifically about the eastern span column spacing. I walked her through the load distribution charts myself, showed her exactly what I was seeing." He paused. "I thought it was a standard city audit. I had no idea what she was there for." He looked at Renata. She saw the same thing I saw. "Yes," Renata said. "And your father had her report in that safe?" "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was very even. Two engineers, same finding, same recommendation, same conclusion. He had both of us in that folder. Renata did not answer because there was nothing to answer. The arithmetic was simple and it was devastating. Two separate professionals working independently had identified the same structural failure with enough time to prevent the collapse. Frank Voss had read both reports, understood precisely what they meant, and chosen to keep the timeline. Clara put her pen down. She reached over without looking up and placed her hand on top of her father's. She left it there for a moment. Then she picked her pen back up and returned to her homework. Daniel watched his daughter do this. Then he looked at the speaker on the step, at the quiet October street beyond the path, at the low light catching the telephone wires at the end of the block. He looked back at Renata. His voice had the quality of something that had been decided not dramatically, not with any performance of resolution, just quietly arrived at the way the most important decisions usually are. "Come back tomorrow," he said. Owen Briggs came to Allegheny Row on a Thursday. He did not call ahead. He did not knock. Daniel saw the car first, a gray sedan less conspicuous than Renata's black one, the kind of vehicle chosen by a man who had spent 40 years knowing precisely when not to be noticed. It parked across the street from number 17 rather than in front of it. A small calculation that revealed more about Owen Briggs than he probably intended it to. Daniel went to the front door and opened it before Briggs reached the sidewalk. Owen Briggs was 61 years old, trim, precise, the kind of man who arrived early to every meeting and considered it a form of professional communication. He had been Voss Meridian's chief legal officer for 19 years. He had navigated 3 separate regulatory investigations, 2 construction fatalities, and a federal contract dispute that had gone to arbitration for 4 years. He had kept the company intact through all of it. He was not by nature a man who came to residential streets in the afternoon. He walked to the end of Daniel's front path and stopped. He did not come up the steps. He stood on the public sidewalk, legally on neutral ground, visibly non-threatening, precisely positioned at the boundary of a space that was not his. Everything about where he stood was a calculation. "I wanted to speak with you directly," Briggs said. "Professional to professional." Daniel said nothing. Briggs looked at the house briefly, then back at Daniel. "You have a daughter, 8 years old." He said it without inflection, but the information itself carried the weight he intended. "I want you to think carefully about what opening this investigation does to her. Not in the abstract concretely. Press coverage. Her name attached to a prolonged legal proceeding. The disruption to a child who has already experienced considerable disruption." He paused. "Renata Voss is pursuing something that is ultimately about her own reconciliation with her father's legacy. I understand that impulse. But you should be clear about who actually carries the cost of what she's proposing." He waited. Daniel looked at Owen Briggs for a long moment. He took in the careful suit, the composed face, the specific, practiced stillness of a man who had delivered versions of this conversation many times before and had become very good at making them sound like genuine concern. He did not say anything. He stood at the top of his steps and he waited. Owen Briggs held his position for approximately 30 seconds. Then the silence became something he could not negotiate with, and he nodded once almost to himself and turned and walked back to his gray sedan. Daniel watched the car pull away from the curb. He stood in the doorway until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then he thought about what Briggs had said, "You have a daughter," and the precise way he had said it. The cadence of a man who had researched the information rather than felt anything about it. That was the tell. That was always the tell. You could perform concern. You could not replicate the specific quality of someone who actually had some. He went inside. He went to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over his hands and then his face. He stood there for a moment with his hands braced against the edge of the sink, looking at the window above it and the October light on the other side of the glass. Then he dried his face, picked up his phone, and called Leon Ashby. Leon was a careful man with a careful mind. They had met on a job site 15 years ago before Leon retook the bar exam after a long detour through construction management, and they had stayed in touch the way men sometimes stay in touch, not frequently, but genuinely. Leon came to the kitchen table that evening after Clara had gone upstairs, and they sat with coffee, and he laid everything out in plain language. The civil filing thread, if it came, the likely legal sequence, the exposure on both sides. He went through all of it without telling Daniel what to do because that was not what Daniel had asked for. What Daniel had asked for was a clear map of the terrain, and Leon gave him that. Then Leon said something that was not on the map, but that mattered anyway. The documentation is solid, Leon said. If you decide to move forward, I can help you do it in a way that protects you as much as anything in this situation can be protected. He paused. It won't be safe. I won't tell you it will be safe, but it can be done right. After Leon left, Daniel washed the coffee cups and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard in the dark. He thought about Roy Tatum's warning. He thought about Owen Briggs using Clara's name the way a man uses information he has researched. He thought about Frank Voss's voice on the porch. Good work out here. He thought about Elspeth Garland walking the eastern span, asking about column spacing, seeing exactly what Daniel had seen. Two engineers, same finding, same recommendation, both buried in the same safe. The letter arrived on a Friday morning. Daniel found it in the mailbox between a water bill and a grocery store circular. Plain white envelope. Return address he did not recognize. 3 words printed in the upper left corner. Meridian Recovery Solutions, LLC. He opened it at the kitchen table while Clara ate cereal across from him. She was telling him about a disagreement at school involving a disputed rule in a game he did not fully understand, and he was listening to her with his full attention because she was 8 years old, and the disputed rule mattered to her, and therefore it merited everything he had. He read the letter once. Then he read it again. The letter informed him that an outstanding legal obligation of $22,000 described as administrative and processing costs incurred during the Kellerman Bridge safety investigation had been transferred to Meridian Recovery Solutions for collection. Payment was due within 30 days. Failure to pay would initiate civil proceedings and could result in a lien being placed on his property at the address listed. His property. This house. The one Clara was eating cereal in right now, still explaining the disputed rule with the focused earnestness she brought to matters of fairness. Daniel folded the letter carefully. He slid it into the back pocket of his jeans. That sounds like the rule wasn't written down anywhere, he said to Clara, which means both interpretations are probably valid. Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. That's what I said. Then you were right. She nodded satisfied and returned to her cereal. He waited until she was on the school bus. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the bus until it turned off Allegheny Row and disappeared. Then he went out to the back porch and called Renata. She answered on the first ring. He read her the letter. The silence that followed told him 2 things at once. She had not known about it, and she understood immediately what it was. There are no administrative costs assessed against you from the Kellerman investigation, she said carefully. I've read every document from that proceeding. This does not exist. This is not a debt. I know what it is. I can have this dissolved in a week. My attorney can contact them directly and... No. The word came out harder than he intended. He steadied himself. No, I won't have you paying off threats made against me by your company's people. That's not how this works. Daniel, if you pay it, then every morning I walk through that door, I'll know this house was saved by Voss money. I can't live in that, and I will not let Clara grow up in it. A pause, long enough to mean something. I understand, Renata said quietly. I won't touch it. He stood on the back porch for a long time after the call ended, looking at the rear face of the house, at the window of Clara's room on the 2nd floor, at the small square of October sky visible between the roof lines. He had spent 6 years protecting his daughter from all of this. He had been very careful, very deliberate, very certain that keeping the story buried was the safest thing he could do for her. But the thing he had been protecting her from had just sent a letter to their mailbox. It had used the word property to describe the house she ate breakfast in every morning. It had put a number on what it would cost to keep it. Staying quiet was not protection anymore. It was just losing slowly instead of all at once. He called Leon Ashby. Leon answered, listened, and was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke with the directness of a man who understood that when certain things became clear, you did not circle them. This is a procedural trap, Leon said. They're not going to collect $22,000. They're going to let the 30-day window expire, file an amended complaint, and use that filing to seal all related documentation under a discovery hold. Any evidence you want to make public gets locked inside legal proceedings for a minimum of 18 months. Daniel stood very still on the back porch. How long before the amended filing window opens? He said. 9 days, Leon said. Maybe 10. 9 days. Daniel looked at the back of the house, at the window of Clara's room, at the narrow square of sky above the roofline, pale and cold, and entirely indifferent to the calculations being made beneath it. He thought about Frank Voss's hand in his on a construction site. Good work out here. He thought about an empty folder in a third drawer. He thought about a hospital room and a cartoon giraffe, and a 3-year-old who had grown up not knowing that the world owed her an explanation. He thought about what Leon had said. It won't be safe, but it can be done right. Leon, he said, I need you to walk me through exactly what doing this right looks like. He did not sleep well that Friday night. Not the restless, turning kind of sleeplessness that comes from unresolved anxiety. Something quieter than that. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the house settle around him, the way old houses do, the pipe in the wall, the floor in the hallway that creaked in the same spot every time Clara turning over in her bed across the hall. Small sounds, the sounds of a life that had been built carefully out of whatever materials remained after the larger things were gone. He had lived in this house for 11 years. He and Diane had found it together. The kitchen was 20 years out of date, and the upstairs bathroom had a leak considerably worse than the inspector had indicated. They fixed what they could fix themselves and saved for the rest. And slowly, over 3 years, they had made it into something that felt genuinely theirs. After Diane died, the house became something else. Not a monument, he was not built that way, but it became the ground he stood on. The one stable thing in Clara's life after the unstable years. She knew which stair to skip when she was trying to be quiet. She knew the kitchen window stuck in summer, and you had to push hard on the left side. She knew the backyard in every season, and someone had decided to use it as a pressure point. He got up at 5, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the Meridian Recovery Solutions letter flattened in front of him. He read it a third time, not because he had forgotten it, he had memorized it, but because he was looking for the seam, the place where the legal language thinned and you could see the machinery underneath. He found it in the third paragraph. Costs incurred in connection with the administrative review process. No invoice number, no itemized breakdown, no reference to any contractual obligation that would have made such costs his responsibility. Just a number, a deadline, and a return address. This was not a debt. It was a document designed to resemble one. And it had done something else besides threaten him. It had made the other side visible. For 6 years, what had happened to Daniel existed mostly as absence. The absence of work, the absence of Diane, the absence of his name from records where it belonged. The harm was real, but it was diffused, spread across years, hard to point at directly. The letter was different. The letter had a return address, a dollar amount, a deadline, and it told him something he had not fully understood until now. Whoever sent it knew Renata had made contact. The silence he had maintained for 6 years was already broken not by him, but by the simple fact of her arriving on his street. There was nothing left to protect by staying still. He heard Clara's alarm go off upstairs. He heard her hit snooze. Then again. "Second one's the last one," he called. A muffled sound from above that might have been acknowledgement. He started making her breakfast. He called Renata that morning after Clara left for school, and they talked for 40 minutes. By the end, they had the shape of a plan, not a perfect one, because plans in situations like this were never perfect. Too many variables, too many places where something could go wrong. But it was a real plan built on real evidence, and they had 9 days to execute it before the legal window closed. Leon Ashby would handle the procedural side. A media attorney named Carol Reeves, whom Leon trusted completely, would review every document for legal exposure before anything became public. 14 journalists had been identified, local reporters, 2 national construction industry publications, and 1 investigative outlet that had covered the Kellerman collapse years earlier without ever being able to break through the company's legal insulation. The press conference would be at a hotel on Clement Street, 8 blocks from the courthouse. Neutral ground, no Voss Meridian branding anywhere in the building. Daniel would attend. He would speak if he chose to. His choice entirely, Carol had said. He told Renata he would speak. "There's one more thing," Daniel said. Leon found out the board isn't just moving toward administrative leave. They're building a termination with cause unauthorized disclosure of proprietary company information. If they file before we go public, they can argue that anything you release is the result of a breach of fiduciary duty. It poisons the evidence before it reaches anyone. Renata was quiet for a moment. "When does the board meet?" "Friday, 10 in the morning." Another pause, then, "We move Thursday." That evening, Daniel sat on the edge of Clara's bed. The lamp was on. Her book was closed on the nightstand. She was looking at him with the particular quality of attention she brought to conversations she had decided were important. Completely still, eyes directly on his face, giving him everything she had. He told her that a long time ago, before she was old enough to remember, he had a job he loved, that he had found a problem on a bridge and reported it because that was his job and because it was the right thing to do, that the people in charge had not listened, that people got hurt, that afterward his name had been put on the wrong side of what happened and he had been carrying that wrong name ever since. He told her that the woman who had been coming to sit on their porch steps was the daughter of the man who had made those decisions, that she had found documents, her father had kept documents that told the true story, that tomorrow they were both going to a room full of reporters and they were going to tell that true story out loud. Clara listened the way she listened to everything that mattered, completely, without interruption, without the visible processing that most people display when they are receiving something complicated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Is it scary?" she said. "Yes," Daniel said. He did not hesitate. "But you're going to do it anyway." "Yes." She considered this. "Is it because of me?" Not an accusation, a genuine question from someone who wanted the actual answer and had the capacity to tell the difference between that and the reassuring substitute. Daniel looked at his daughter, at this person who had been 3 years old under a cartoon giraffe blanket and had grown up in the years since into someone he could not fully explain, someone he had tried to protect, who had been quietly, efficiently protecting him right back the entire time without once asking for acknowledgement. "Partly," he said honestly, "and partly because it's the right thing to do." Clara nodded slowly, filing the information in its proper place. "Like filing the report," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, exactly like that." She reached over and pulled the blanket up, settled back against her pillow. "Then, hey, Dad." "Yeah." "The drawings in the hallway, the ones I made when I was little. What about them? You never took them down." She looked at him evenly. "I used to think you just forgot, but I don't think that anymore." He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She was right. He had never forgotten. He had looked at those drawings every single morning for years, and they had been in ways he had never put into words before this moment. Exactly the thing that reminded him who he was when everything outside the house was telling him something different. "Get some sleep," he said. She closed her eyes. He turned off the lamp. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark, looking at the row of drawings along the wall. The crayon houses with yellow windows, the stick figures with enormous hands, the purple horse in its own distinct artistic category. Then he went downstairs, made himself a cup of tea. He did not particularly want, but that gave his hands something to do, and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet until it cooled. Then he rinsed the cup, set it on the rack, and went upstairs. He lay in the dark, not restless. The particular stillness of a man for whom a decision has been made and the making of it is finished, and all that remains is to do the thing. He slept. He was up before his alarm. 5:15. The house dark and quiet, Allegheny Row suspended in the hour before dawn when even the neighborhood dogs had not started yet. He showered. He dressed carefully, dark slacks and the blue button-down shirt Diane had picked out at a department store sale years ago. He had kept it without particularly thinking about keeping it. It still fit. Some things held their shape. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, not rehearsing anything, not performing anything for himself, just looking at the face of a man who was 42 years old and had been carrying the wrong name for 6 years and was about to set it down. Downstairs, he made coffee and made Clara's lunch while the coffee brewed. Sandwich apple, the small bag of crackers she liked. The 1,000 small acts of fatherhood that accumulated over years into the architecture of a child's sense of being cared for. Clara came downstairs at 7 wearing her burgundy jacket, the one she saved for school picture days. She had brushed her hair without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at him with the calm, direct gaze she had been giving him her entire life. "You look nice," he said. "So do you," she said, very seriously. He put her cereal in front of her. She ate. He drank his coffee. The October morning light came through the kitchen window at its low angle and fell across the table between them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything at all. At 8:15, he walked her to the corner for the school bus. Mrs. Aldridge from number 23 would pick her up at noon and bring her to the hotel by 12:30. They had arranged this 2 days ago. Mrs. Aldridge had not asked for details. She was the kind of neighbor who understood that certain things required logistics rather than explanation. At the corner, Clara adjusted her backpack strap. She looked up at him. "Tell the truth," she said. "Matter of fact. The way you remind someone of something they already know but that bears saying out loud anyway." "That's the plan," he said. The bus came, she got on, he watched it go. Then he walked back to the house, got his keys, and drove across the city. The hotel on Clement Street was mid-size and deliberately neutral, the kind of place that hosted regional conferences and retirement dinners and occasionally press events for people who needed ground that did not belong to anyone in particular. Renata had checked personally that no Voss Meridian branding appeared anywhere in the building. Daniel arrived at 9:40. Renata was already there with Carol Reeves, who had the brisk, unsentimental energy of someone who had done this before and understood precisely which details mattered. They shook hands. Carol walked Daniel through the sequence. Renata would speak first, evidence in order. Daniel would be offered the opportunity to speak after. No obligation. "I'll speak," Daniel said. Carol made a note. At 9:50, he went into the room. 14 journalists, 2 television cameras along the left wall. The low preparatory hum of people who understood they were waiting for something significant. Daniel walked to the back row and chose the seat nearest the wall closest to the door. He had always liked knowing where the exit was, not because he intended to use it, but because knowing it was there made it possible to choose to stay. He put his hands flat on his thighs. He breathed. At 10:02, Clara arrived with Mrs. Aldridge. They came in quietly. Clara found Daniel, immediately walked to him, and sat in the seat beside him without saying anything. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were important. Mrs. Aldridge sat on her other side. At 10:05, Renata walked to the front of the room. She stood behind the podium without notes and without gripping its edges. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked out at the cameras and the journalists, and all the recording equipment pointed in her direction, and she began to speak. She spoke for 22 minutes. She described finding the safe, sitting on her father's office floor in the dark after the reception ended, opening the folder, reading the memo by the light of her phone. She described hiring a private document examiner before she acted on anything. She described the weeks of cross-referencing the forensic accountant, the certainty she had arrived at before she drove to Allegheny Row. She presented Daniel's original warning report. She presented Elspeth Garland's independent structural assessment dated 14 days before the collapse, confirming everything Daniel had identified and recommending an immediate halt. She described the chain of internal correspondence between Frank Voss and Owen Briggs. Then she reached under the podium and produced the small speaker. "I'm going to play a recorded phone call," she said. "It has been verified for authenticity by 3 independent forensic audio firms. The verification reports are in the documentation packet being distributed to each of you now." She connected the drive. She pressed play. Frank Voss's voice filled the room, low, unhurried, completely certain of itself. "That's been managed. If anything happens on site, we document it as equipment failure. The supervisor's report doesn't exist officially, so it can't be cited. Make sure Briggs knows the timeline on the filing." The recording ended. The room was absolutely still. Not the polite quiet of people listening to a presentation. Something different. The specific silence that falls when a room full of people hears something they understand is true and understand simultaneously that it changes something that cannot be unchanged. Renata waited one full beat. Then she continued. She stated clearly, without legal hedging, without the softening vocabulary of institutional communications, that Daniel Pruitt had identified the structural problem at Kellerman Bridge, that he had filed a proper report through correct channels, that he had been deliberately removed from the official record to protect the company's timeline and financial position, that her father had read the report, understood its implications, and chosen to suppress it, that he had then paid a government official $47,000 to ensure that suppression held. She did not say mistakes were made. She did not say missteps or oversights or a failure of process. She said my father made a choice. It was a wrong choice made with full awareness of its consequences for another person and his family. I am here because that choice has to be named for what it was. She stopped. A journalist near the front raised her hand. Does Daniel Pruitt wish to make a statement? Daniel stood. He walked from the back row to the front of the room at the pace he moved when something mattered, and he wanted to be steady. He stood beside Renata. He looked out at the cameras, at the journalists, at all of it pointed at him. And he felt something he had not felt in 6 years. Not triumph, not the electric satisfaction of vindication he had sometimes imagined in the bad years, when imagining it was all that was available. Something quieter than any of those things. A solidity. The specific sensation of standing on terrain that actually reflected what was true. He spoke without notes. I did my job. I identified a problem. I documented it. I reported it through every proper channel available to me. What happened after that was not my failure. His voice was steady, not loud, not performing anything. I spent 6 years carrying a name that did not belong to me. Today I want the record to reflect what actually happened. He paused. I am not here for sympathy. I am here because my daughter is sitting in the back of this room, and I want her to know that the truth is worth saying out loud, even when it costs something. He looked at Clara. Especially then. He walked back to his seat. Clara looked up at him when he sat down. She did not say anything. She reached over and put her hand on top of his and left it there. Voss Meridian issued a statement within 2 hours. The evidence had been selectively presented. The audio recording was unverified. The company was committed to a thorough internal review. Owen Briggs appeared on a local business news program that evening. He used the word context 17 times in 8 minutes. He was precise and composed and said nothing that could be directly refuted while also saying nothing that was entirely honest. He had been doing this for 19 years, and he was very good at it. That night, Owen Briggs sat alone in his car in the parking garage beneath the Voss Meridian building. He did not go back upstairs. He sat in the gray sedan with the engine off and opened his phone and looked at the names in his contacts. He looked for a long time. He did not call anyone. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked through the windshield at the concrete pillar directly in front of him. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 19 years keeping a machine running that he had understood, at least in part, did not deserve to keep running. He had told himself it was pragmatism. He had told himself it was the nature of operating at scale. He had told himself a great many things. Sitting alone in a parking garage with Frank Voss's voice on public record and the $47,000 check now in the hands of investigators, he found that none of those things were available to him anymore. All that remained was what he had actually done and the years ahead in which he would have to account for it. He was not an evil man in the simple sense. He was something more ordinary than that, and more difficult to forgive a man who had known what was right and had consistently chosen what was convenient instead. He sat there for a long time. Then he drove home. The board voted to place Renata on administrative leave pending internal review, 7-2. She received the notification by email at 4:17. She read it, set her phone down, made a cup of tea. She had expected it. She had planned for it. It still landed with weight the way expected things sometimes do when they stop being abstract and become actual. But the documents were already public. The audio file had already been downloaded and shared and was moving through channels that no communications team could slow, let alone stop. By midnight, the recording had been picked up by 2 regional outlets in a national construction industry publication. The first structural crack in the official story came the following morning. Diana Okoro had been working the Kellerman story for 3 years without ever being able to break through the legal insulation around the company. The press conference gave her the proof she had been unable to find, and the proof gave her traction with sources who had previously been unwilling to speak on record. She obtained an internal processing memo from the Regional Safety Board, a document that had quietly logged Daniel's certified delivery as undeliverable due to insufficient sender information. The name of the official who had signed that memo matched the name on the payable line of the $47,000 check found in Frank Voss's safe. Not a corporate failure, not an institutional oversight, a transaction. A specific amount of money paid to a specific person to ensure a specific document never reached the people it was addressed to. She published the following morning. Leon called Daniel that evening and read the Okoro story aloud over the phone slowly, the way Leon did when he wanted to make sure the weight of something landed correctly. When he got to the part about the check, the $47,000, the name on the payable line matching the name on the safety board memo, Daniel set his coffee cup down on the kitchen table. He had known Frank Voss had buried the report. He had known since the recording on the porch that Frank had made a deliberate choice. But there was a difference between a man who chose to look away and a man who paid someone else to do the looking away for him. The first was cowardice. The second was something colder and more calculated and considerably harder to explain away. He bought it, Daniel said. Yes, Leon said. Daniel did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the kitchen window at the dark outside it, at the pale reflection of the overhead light on the glass. Clara was 3 years old, he said quietly. When her mother died, she was 3 years old, and someone had already paid to make sure I couldn't fight back, that the doors would be closed before I reached them. Leon was quiet. Okay, Daniel said. Okay. He picked up his coffee cup. Thank you for calling. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after they hung up. He held it, the full shape of it, finally, in every dimension it had. Not just what had been done to him, but the deliberateness of it. The planning. The $47,000 that had ensured a 3-year-old girl would grow up without her mother, and that the man responsible would live out the rest of his life, never once having to look at what he had set in motion. He held that for a while. Then he got up, rinsed his cup, and went upstairs to check on Clara. The story did not stay regional. By the end of the first week, a state-level oversight committee had announced an independent review of the Kellerman investigation and 3 other infrastructure projects completed by Voss Meridian in the same period. 2 board members resigned on the same afternoon within 3 hours of each other, releasing identical 2-line statements about pursuing other opportunities. The official at the Regional Safety Board resigned and retained criminal defense counsel. A former Voss Meridian project coordinator confirmed on record that Frank Voss had routinely recorded calls with project directors for years, that the recording Renata had released was consistent with a practice she had personally observed, and that had been an open secret within the company's upper management. Meridian Recovery Solutions withdrew its civil filing against Daniel with no explanation and no communication. The lien threat against number 17 Allegheny Row was dissolved. The case number was voided. It disappeared as completely as if the letter had never been sent. Daniel received the legal confirmation on a Thursday morning. He stood in the kitchen and read the email from Leon Ashby twice. Then he set his phone down and stood with his hand resting on the counter. He had held this house for 11 years, through the worst years, through the months when he genuinely did not know how he was going to manage the mortgage, through the invisible blacklisting and the suspended certifications and the particular grinding weight of being a skilled man who could not practice his skill. Through all of it, he had held this house. It was still his, entirely and without qualification his. He made breakfast and waited for Clara to come downstairs. 6 weeks after the press conference, a letter arrived from the state licensing authority. Not a collection notice, not a legal threat. A formal letter on official letterhead informing Daniel Pruitt that the suspension of his professional certifications initiated in the aftermath of the Kellerman Bridge investigation had been reviewed by the board and found to have been based on documentation that did not accurately represent the events in question. His certifications were reinstated effective immediately. Attached was a written acknowledgement, 1 page signed by the board chair, stating that the original suspension had been issued on the basis of falsified investigative materials and did not reflect any professional deficiency on the part of Daniel Pruitt. He read the acknowledgement 3 times. It was 1 page, official letterhead, formal language, standard government formatting. It was also the first time in 6 years that a document with any institutional authority had said in writing with a signature attached that what happened to him was not his fault. He went to the spare bedroom. He opened the filing cabinet. 3rd drawer. He placed the acknowledgement inside a new folder with his name written on the tab in his own handwriting. He was about to slide the drawer closed when he saw it sitting at the back corner of the drawer, where it had rested undisturbed for 6 years because no one had known it was worth taking. A small metal binder clip, blue, the kind Diane used to buy in bulk from the office supply store because she said the standard silver ones were too easy to lose on a white desk. She had pressed a handful of them into his palm one evening before the Kellerman project began. For your important documents, she had said, with the specific practicality that had been one of the things he loved most about her. So you don't lose them. He had lost what it was meant to hold, but the clip itself had stayed. Daniel stood in the spare bedroom holding the blue clip. He stood there for a long time in the afternoon light that came through the spare bedroom window in late November, in the quiet of the house he had held through everything. He did not cry. He was not that kind of man, and this was not that kind of moment. It was something else, the feeling of something being complete, not resolved in the sense of being erased. The losses were still the losses and would remain so, but complete in the sense of finally having its true shape, finally being seen for what it actually was rather than what the official record had said it was. He used the blue clip to close the new folder. He pressed it into place with the same deliberate care he used for everything that mattered. He put the folder back in the third drawer. He closed the drawer. He stood in the room for another moment. Then he went downstairs and started dinner. Renata resigned from Voss Meridian on a Monday morning, 3 months after the press conference, before the board could take the choice away from her. She issued a brief public statement. 7 words: I was not willing to inherit the silence. She established the Kellerman Labor Trust from her personal assets, her own money accumulated over years from distributions and gifts, and the inheritance of growing up as the daughter of a man who had built something large. The trust was designated to support workers displaced or harmed by Voss Meridian projects over the preceding decade. She did not name it after herself. She did not name it after her father. She named it after the bridge because she believed that the place where something goes wrong should be remembered rather than erased. That erasure was precisely how the wrong thing kept happening. She began building something smaller afterward: a consultancy, a small team, community infrastructure projects with labor transparency and independent safety oversight written into every contract from the first day, not as a public relations gesture, but as the actual structure of how the work would be done. It was smaller than anything the Voss name had ever been attached to. She found she did not mind. She found, in fact, that the smallness was part of what made it feel real. She could see the whole of it. She could understand every part of it. She could be accountable for it in the direct and personal way that accountability required, not managed accountability, not institutional accountability, but the kind where you can see the face of every person affected by your decisions. She thought about her father occasionally, not with the searing anger of the early weeks, not with the grief of the funeral. Something more complex than either. Something that held both the man she had known, who had been capable and often kind and present in the ways he knew how to be present, and the man revealed by 3 sentences in a handwritten memo. Both of those men were her father. She was not going to resolve the tension between them into a simpler story. Simple stories were part of how this had happened in the first place. The Eastbrook Community Center opened on a Saturday morning in February. It was 2 miles from Allegheny Row. Single-story brick, large windows along the south face to let the afternoon light in. A small plaza out front with 2 benches and a young tree that had been planted the week before, held upright by 3 wooden stakes, and the quiet optimism of people who understood that some things needed time and care before they could stand on their own. Daniel arrived with Clara at 9:10. She was wearing the burgundy jacket. She got out of the car and immediately crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly to assess the building. The posture she brought to every structure she encountered, the habit she had absorbed from years of watching her father read the bones of things without ever being formally taught to do it herself. Renata was near the entrance when they walked up. She shook Daniel's hand and smiled at Clara, who gave the building one more careful look and then apparently reached a conclusion she found satisfactory. "Can I go look?" Clara said. "Stay where I can see you," Daniel said. She was already moving. She walked the full perimeter of the building, stopping at each corner to examine the roofline. She crouched at the northeast corner, the spot where Daniel had flagged a drainage concern during the specifications review and recommended an additional moisture barrier. She seemed to find what she was looking for. She stood, nodded once to herself, and continued. "She does that everywhere," Daniel said. "I know," Renata said. "I've seen you do it. When we talked on the steps, you'd look at the houses across the street the same way, reading them." He had not known he did that. Roy Tatum appeared beside him during the brief dedication remarks, materializing quietly the way Roy always did, simply present when he chose to be without announcement or ceremony. They stood together in the main room afterward, looking up at the ceiling joists and the lighting track and the invisible infrastructure that made the building function properly. Daniel read it the way he read every structure. It was good work, clean, done right, the kind of work that would hold. Roy stood with his hands in his jacket pockets for a moment, looking up alongside him. Then he looked at Daniel. "You did good," he said. Not an apology for the doubts he had expressed on Allegheny Row. Roy Tatum was not the kind of man who turned necessary caution into something requiring formal retraction. He said what needed to be said in the fewest words that could carry the full weight of it, and then he was done. "Thank you, Roy," Daniel said. Roy nodded, went to find coffee. Daniel found Clara in the small library room at the back of the building. She was standing in front of the empty shelves with her arms crossed and her head tilted, the same posture she had used on the exterior, now applied to the interior problem of shelves that existed without books. He came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" he said. "They need books," she said. "They'll get them." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, the way she was satisfied with any answer that was true and direct, and did not try to be more than it was. Then she looked up at him and asked the question he had been half expecting since they walked through the door, delivered in the direct, unhurried way. She delivered questions she had been holding for a while and had decided it was now the correct time to release. "Is the debt paid now?" Not the way a child asks whether a movie has resolved satisfactorily. The way she asked all the real questions with the expectation of the actual answer and the clear ability to distinguish it from the comfortable version. Renata had come to stand near them, close enough to hear. Daniel looked at his daughter. He thought about the folder in Frank Voss's safe, the recording on the porch, the press conference and the licensing board letter and the lien that had been dissolved without explanation. He thought about Diane in the hospital room. He thought about 6 years of carrying the wrong name. He thought about what was true, not what would make this moment easier, but what was actually precisely true. "Not entirely," he said. "Some things can't be fully paid back. That's just the truth of it." Clara held his gaze, listening. "But we're not carrying it for someone else anymore," he said. "The record says what actually happened now. What I did is in the permanent record. That doesn't go away." He paused. "And the people who made the wrong decisions have to live with what they did. That's not nothing." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Renata. "Did you know?" she said. Not an accusation, a genuine question. "No," Renata said. "Not until I found the folder." "What did you do when you found out?" Renata looked at this 8-year-old standing in front of empty shelves with her arms crossed and her jacket buttoned all the way to the top and her face entirely serious. "I drove to your street," Renata said, "and I told your father the truth." Clara held this for a moment with the thoroughness it deserved. Then she uncrossed her arms. She nodded once, the considered conclusive nod of someone who has received an answer that meets the standard she was applying and who is now prepared to move forward. "Okay," she said. She looked at the empty shelves one more time. "I'm going to donate some of my books," she announced with the tone of someone making an official declaration of intent that should be noted by those present, for when they open the library part. Then she walked past them both toward the door, finished with this section of the morning and ready for whatever came next. Daniel watched her go. He stood for a moment in the small library room with its empty shelves and its south-facing window, and the pale February light coming through it at the low angle that light takes in that month, when the sun is still working its way back, and everything it touches looks careful and considered and new. He looked at Renata. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying now that had not already been said across the weeks and months that had brought them to this room on porch steps, and in phone calls and in a hotel room where a recording had filled the air and changed what the record said permanently. Outside the large south-facing window, the small plaza was visible in the February morning light. The 2 benches, the brick pavers, and the young tree standing in the cold air held upright by its 3 wooden stakes. It had been planted 1 week ago. The ground around it had been prepared carefully. The stakes had been set at the correct angles by people who understood that certain things needed support before they could stand on their own, and who had done the work of providing that support without any guarantee of the outcome. Some things needed time to take root. That was simply true, and it had always been true, and knowing it did not make the waiting easier, but it did make it comprehensible. You planted the thing, you staked it, you kept the ground around it clear, you waited. And if the conditions were right, if the truth had been told when it needed to be told, if the work had been done correctly, if the record had been corrected, and the name that belonged on the right side of history had finally been moved there, then eventually, in its own time, it held. Daniel walked toward the door. Outside, Clara was standing in the plaza with her hand resting on the trunk of the young tree, testing it, checking whether it was going to be all right. She had the same expression she brought to the northeast corner of the building, to the column spacing on the eastern span of a bridge. She had only ever heard describe the focused, serious attention of someone who has decided that a thing matters and is therefore going to assess it properly. He thought it was probably going to be all right. He thought most things, given enough time and enough honesty and enough people willing to stand up in rooms and say out loud what they had found, what they had documented and reported, and refused to stop believing. Even when the official record said otherwise, most things probably were. The morning was clear. The sky over Pittsburgh was pale blue and wide, the kind of February sky that holds no clouds and makes the cold feel clean rather than punishing. The ground underfoot was level. Daniel Pruitt walked out into it,